It's week 6, and the question is, what is nature? Before we get started, I do want to acknowledge that this is a huge group effort. The people on the Centennial Committee, the people in the School of the Arts and Architecture, the people here in the Department of World Arts and Culture's Dance, in particular, my colleagues Anne-Marie Burke, Louise Kale, and Kylie Kerrigan. Thank you so much. And of course, because we are a public university and a land-grant institution, we also want to acknowledge and recognize the Gabrielina Tongva people as the original caretakers of this land, and we're thankful to be visitors here. So, because it's week 6, and we have a 10-week quarter, hence 10 questions, this seems like a good time to just pause and reflect. What are we doing here in 10 questions? If you're not asking that, be assured I am. So when we ask these questions each week, are we expecting that we're going to have an answer to the question? No. Thank you. No, I don't think so. I don't think so. Tonight we're not going to leave here knowing what nature is. Thank you. Nor truth, nor love, nor justice, nor knowledge, nor even a university. But what we do know that there's plenty to unpack in any of those questions. And why ask those questions? Because I believe they are always with us at the heart of our work, our relationships, our family, the ways in which we create meaning in our lives. So we in the university should be thinking about how we create meaning in our lives, not just about acquiring knowledge. And then the other question in this sixth week review is, why in this format? Why are we doing these conversations? And I was reminded by one of our TAs the other day that Peter Sellers in that first week said to us, well, the easy problems, they're getting solved. The really big problems, those are the ones we need to work on. So we don't have easy solutions, but we do know that the university is a center, a hub, a place of tremendous knowledge from all directions, from all different disciplines. And so how can we encourage the university to come together, to help us to integrate these areas of knowledge? There's so much information in our lives. What do we do with it? So these evenings are an opportunity to unpack and also put together what we know and what's available here in the university. Nature is a lot to unpack. And if you'll allow me to share this thought with you, that nature is an idea determined by beliefs and lived experience. And for different people in different places of the world at different times in history, nature has meant different things. So not only can we not define it, but we need to understand that it's a movable idea. And I'd like to just share a couple of ways in which this idea moves. So if we look, for example, at one particular religion, in Genesis 1:28, and I quote, "And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth." Students, you have said nature is magnificent, monumental, everlasting. You said it was beautiful, free, pure, untouched, a place for the soul. And one of those really keen observers said, it's a car, which I agree. Nature is also a prized possession, something that we buy, we sell, we control, and from which we, as we know, extract valuable things like gold or oil, or as Stephanie Pinsettle told us a few weeks ago, lithium for our phones. And so we cut up nature, we section it off, we create borders, and we fight wars over what's there. And I wanted to share one more prism with which to look at nature. In her famous 1972 essay, Sherry Ortner, who happens to be a UCLA emeriti anthropologist, asked, "Is female to male as nature is to culture?" So her observation, among other feminist writers of her time, was that within the cultural imaginary, nature sits in opposition to culture. And in that binary, nature is wild, irrational, and beyond control. As childbearers, women are often associated with nature, controlled by the moon, mysterious, temperamental, irrational, needing to be controlled. And men, who are rational, are culture producers. They produce knowledge, and they subdue nature. So even in Sherry Ortner's observation was that even in the ways we think about nature and culture, we also parallel our ideas about gender. As a choreographer, I often hear dancers talk about, well, this is really natural, this thing I'm doing here. And, and I always just want to stop and pause, like, what made that natural? And of course, yeah, it does feel natural when you've trained and you've done something over and over again. It's like how you make a line on paper. It's just natural that I make that line like that. It's just natural that I eat with a fork and a knife. But these are techniques. We train, and once we train enough, what we do becomes natural. It's not as if nature just not inhibiting, it's nature's not just coming through you. Of course you are nature. But so all life is natural, not just certain sets of things, but the word natural, and here's the important thing, is frequently deployed as against unnatural to sustain dominance and power. So we call things unnatural that we wish to dismiss or push away or are frightening or basically we're not familiar with. But finally, of course, you said, and I mean you students, you said we might think of nature as an it outside ourselves. And you reminded us that we forget that we are nature. And I just want to end my introduction with a poem. This is called Singularity by Marie Howe, and it was a tribute to Stephen Hawking. Do you sometimes want to wake up to the singularity we once were? So compact, nobody needed a bed or food or money. Nobody hiding in the school bathroom or home alone, pulling open the drawer where the pills are kept. For every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you. Remember? There was no nature, no them, no tests to determine if the elephant grieves her calf or if the coral reef feels pain. Trashed oceans don't speak English or Farsi or French. Would that we could wake up to what we were when we were ocean, and before that to when sky was earth and animal was energy and rock was liquid and stars were space and space was not at all nothing. Before we came to believe humans were so important, before this awful loneliness, can molecules recall it, what once was, before anything happened? No I, no we, no one, no was, no verb, no noun, only a tiny, tiny dot brimming with is, all, everything, home. So thank you for letting me share that with you. I just thought it was a thing of great beauty. And I of course, want to share that with you because I love you. I learned that last week. I'd like to now invite you to join me in welcoming our three remarkable guests to the stage, and I will introduce them to you, and we will move forward. So please, if you will join me, Evan, Rosemarie, and Rebeca, I will introduce you. This is Evan Meyer, and Evan has an interest in how we experience and define nature in the Anthropocene. He came to UCLA to serve as assistant director of the UCLA Mildred E. Mathias Botanical Garden after managing the Rancho Santa Ana Seed Bank, the world's largest collection of living seeds of rare and endangered plants of California. He also writes an article series called Street Plants that examines the complicated relationship between the cultural and natural worlds through the lens of the plants that grow wild in inner city Los Angeles. Yeah. Thank you. I mean, even when we're like talking and clapping, it's a conversation, right? An artist and designer, Rebeca Méndez's work engages science, design, with a focus on post-humanism, ecofeminism, and environmental justice. She joined the faculty of the UCLA Department of Design Media Arts just a short time ago in 2003, and is the founder and director of Counterforce Lab, a research and fieldwork studio dedicated to using art and design to develop creative collaborations, new fields of study, and methods to research, create, and execute projects around the social and ecological impacts of climate change. Welcome, Rebeca. And Rosemarie Garland-Thomson, I'm very thankful. She's joined us from up north. So she braved the winds and came down to us here in LA today. Rosemarie Garland-Thomson is a disability justice and culture thought leader, bioethicist, teacher, and humanities scholar, also a friend. Her work develops the field of critical disability studies to bring forward disability access, inclusion, and identity to a broad range of institutions and communities. A professor of English and bioethics at Emory University, she teaches disability studies, bioethics, American literature and culture, and feminist theory. She is the author of 6 books and wrote the inaugural article in the ongoing New York Times series about disability, written by people living with disabilities. Welcome, Rosemarie. I'm so glad you're back. So, by previous arrangement, we agreed that Evan would start us off. So we're going to take our seats out here so that we can see your images as you speak.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Victoria, and thank you for having me. It's really an honor to get to talk to you guys about something that I'm very passionate about and think about a lot, the question of what is nature. And of course, my perspective is coming from a person who deals with plants on a very intimate basis by growing them and cultivating them and maintaining scientific collections of them. So that's the perspective you'll get. But I thought we could start with the dictionary definition for tonight. This is from the Oxford Dictionary. Nature is the phenomenon of the physical world collectively, including plants, animals, the landscape, and other features and products of the earth, as opposed to humans and human creations. So right off the bat, they set up that dichotomy between the cultural human world and the natural world. Well, there's some problems with that. Last I checked, Homo sapiens was an animal, and like all animals, we evolved. But I think we can all agree that with our culture and language and technology, we are able to do things that no other animal species is. So we can just maybe move past that, and we'll go back and agree with their definition. So that means that downtown Los Angeles is not nature, right? Nothing here was the way it was before humans altered it. We've altered everything here, and so it's not nature at all. But where did that city come from? Where did all the materials to build it, the concrete, the steel, the glass, where did the electricity to turn the lights on come from? Where did the food to feed the people who lived there come from? And they came from nature. So remember, products of the earth, that was in that original Oxford definition. Well, that, if anything, is products of the earth. I would say this open pit mine, copper mine in British Columbia is products of the earth. So literally, to build our human culture, we extract products of the earth, and we're sitting here enjoying the fruits of these earth products to be able to sit here in this lecture hall tonight. And of course, growing all the food that we consume is very impactful on nature. This is the Texas Panhandle. You can see those mountains in the bottom corner, and then the industrial agriculture and the pivot irrigation that has completely altered that landscape. So if nature and culture are distinct, they certainly are interacting in a very highly intertwined way. So I want to just ask you guys, does this look like nature does everybody? Yeah? Okay. Well, I've been in this place. This is the Nebraska State Forest, and it definitely feels like nature. The birds are chirping, the leaves are rustling, the pine forest is beautiful, but every tree here was planted by a human. This is the largest hand-planted forest in the country, and none of these trees would have been here prior to them being planted, and it would have been open prairie. So this is a product of humans and a cultural product, and in many ways not natural at all. I mean, it's not natural. It would not have been there prior to maybe 100 years ago when we decided to plant it for timber purposes. And how about this? Does this look like nature? Yes? No? I think this is nature. It doesn't look like nature. You got graffiti and concrete. This is Nuys, California, very close to where I live. And all of those plants in the foreground, I can tell you because I'm a botanist, that none of those were planted, as you can tell. They are what we call interstitial elopers, aka weeds. But they've assembled and formed a new community that we are not controlling. And they've gone feral. So is this a feral version of nature re-inhabiting the human landscape? And that's what I hope we can get into in more detail. But hopefully I've convinced you that that dictionary definition is very superficial and outdated and not particularly useful this evening. But there are some things that I think we should talk about quickly that will hopefully frame our discussion tonight. So the first is the concept of wilderness. Now this is often misconstrued with nature. Wilderness is a landscape which really is untouched primarily by humans. And a good example is Death Valley National Park. So you can see everything that shaped this landscape is geological or ecological. There are no roads, there's no power lines. And so this is a relatively new kind of concept of calling it wilderness. All of the world was wilderness at one point. Now most studies are saying about 25% of the land mass of the earth is actually quote unquote wilderness, which is this pretty much untouched landscape. But it's not really untouched. Obviously climate change is having major impacts on it, invasive species, and then things like the deposition of smog. When smog goes up in the air, it has to come back down, and it comes back down and changes the ecology of those areas. So these areas, although they're important and should be preserved, they're not untouched by humans. And our concept of nature is problematic in some ways as well, in that we often use a baseline of, at least in North America, we use the baseline of when Europeans arrived in North America. Before that, it was wilderness. After that, when we start changing it, it ceases to be wilderness. Obviously, that's not a good definition because many people were here having major impacts to the landscape before Europeans arrived. The next concept I want to define is biodiversity. This is the sum of all the plants, animals, and organisms on the planet, and the interactions and the food chain, and all the ways that they interact. Here's a good example from our local mountains. Munz's iris, a very rare iris from the Sierra Nevada mountains. Biodiversity is not in a great state right now. I'm sure everybody here is familiar with the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs, the major extinction event that occurred. Many biologists think that we're going through an extinction event right now caused by our own doing, which is very sad because there's a lot of really beautiful life on the Earth that we are possibly going to lose if we continue on the track that we're on. But it's not all doom and gloom. People are working hard to preserve life, and this is what I do on a day-to-day basis, which is manage and maintain ex situ collections. So ex situ means essentially off-site, and this is the act of taking nature out of its natural habitat and bringing it completely into human control to preserve that species. The best example I can give is the California condor, which was very nearly extinct in the 1980s, and a team of scientists went in and actually caught the remaining birds, brought them into a rearing facility, and kind of propagated them, bred them within human control, re-released them, and now you can go into the mountains and find condors. The populations are much higher. I do this with plants, so this is my previous job. These freezers are full of the rare and endangered flora of California, and in these freezers you can keep seeds alive for hundreds of years under the right conditions. And many of the plants maintained here represent places that no longer exist. So the seeds in these freezers may now be like a Walmart, park or a shopping center or something, which is sad, but it does mean that we have this biodiversity to utilize in the future and hopefully reintroduce to re-diversify landscapes. And re-diversifying landscapes and diversifying landscapes is what we as Botanical Garden people are all about. And if you want to see that in action, come visit us at the UCLA Botanical Garden. 7.8 acres, beautiful place, short walk from here. You can come see this tree, the Torrey pine, a rare Southern California pine tree, which is just a beautiful specimen in the garden. And the last thing I want to define are novel ecosystems. So this is what I was kind of alluding to earlier. And this is something I'm really interested in. I have an article series called Street Plants, which examines these landscapes. And what you have here are a bunch of plants from all over the world that have been brought by humans intentionally or unintentionally and have assembled into a new community of life, a new ecology, essentially. So here you have fountain grass and tree tobacco and Mexican fan palm and prickly pear, and they've formed this new novel ecosystem. And these are, do we define this as nature? This is something I hope we can discuss tonight. I'm not really sure, but they certainly support a web of life and animals and all sorts of biodiversity. It's not the biodiversity that was here before we were here, but it is a biodiversity onto its own. If you want to read more, my Street Plants article shares all these plants and these spaces. So as I'm wrapping up here, a few take-home messages. To me, that cultural natural distinction is very vague and possibly doesn't exist at all, really. Those remaining wild places on the planet are super important, and I hope that all of you can be as inspired by them as I've been. And that inspiration can come wherever you find it. It doesn't have to be Yosemite or Death Valley. It can be a back alley in downtown LA. And so just to finish up, I want to show you this photo one more time, because I think this is a good metaphor for nature in 2019. This is an abandoned, the ruins of a temple outside of Bangkok, and this Buddha is being grown into this fig tree, this strangler fig. We as humans are intermeshed in nature in ways that we don't understand. But as a thinking animal and a cultural animal, we can emerge from it and hopefully define our own relationship with it that will be beneficial to us and everything else around us and on the planet. So thanks for having me tonight. I'm looking forward to talking. And yeah.
Okay, you can sit here. Rosemarie, would you take over? Fabulous.
I think we need to be more out here. Is that right?
Yeah, this would be, would you like to be more in the middle of things?
No, I like to be on the edge. But not so far that I'm off the camera.
Yeah, right.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. It's really a delight to be here. My goddess colleague, Victoria Marks, thank you for this opportunity. I'm going to speak to you a little bit tonight about the concept of a freak of nature. And what I'll be talking about actually will be how we have interpreted over time human biodiversity. So I think it'll work out nicely in relation to what Evan was able to talk about. So human culture, of course, has always made what we think of as nature from the raw materials of the environment that we share together. So what counts as nature and what counts as natural, of course, has a history. And this is a bit what I would like to talk to you about tonight. And that history, of course, as history always does, is composed of a story. So in this way, then, nature can be thought of as a story that human beings have told one another about our shared environment and this is important, about one another. So what I want to talk to you about this evening is that some of the stories that we've told about human variations. This is what I want to focus on. The explanations that we've given for why we're different from one another and why we're the same as one another. And for, in some ways, what might be called our tribal affiliations, who we think we are, who we think we're related to, who we think we're like and not like, and how we've gathered ourselves together and defined ourselves collectively over history. So throughout human history, we've always recognized that living things are governed by principles of repetition and regularity. So I'll be talking a lot more about these principles that we take to be the principles that regulate what we think of as nature. So we recognize living things based primarily on their similarities. We know when we're looking at a dog that it's a dog because it's similar to other dogs. We know when we're looking at a person that it's a person because that person, that thing, living thing, is similar to other human beings. So this is an important concept. So what has always, of course, seized human imagination are the exceptions to these patterns of regularity and repetition. In other words, things that are rare and things that are different from expectations, things that seem to violate the standard patterns that we expect. So these are what we sometimes call, in history, freaks of nature, and the Latin term, of course, for this is lusus naturae. They're often called, of course, historically, wonders of the natural world, and this is because the affect, the emotion that these exceptions to regularity and repetition have evoked from us is the old emotion of wonder, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So here's an example of what people in 1506, the anatomist Ambrose Pere imagined as a monstrous birth. This was a picture that Pere drew and chronicled of these exceptions in form, these very rare, interesting freaks of nature. Here's some of the words that have been used historically over the last several centuries in the West, of course, to describe these freaks of nature. Now, freak, of course, meant something quite different then than it means to us now. Monsters, for example, were understood as things that departed from natural form. They had to be rare and they had to be irregular for them to be the omens, the stories. Monster comes from the word demonstrate, which means to show, to prefigure something that is going to happen. Wonders, of course, is another word that was used to talk about these freaks of nature. Prodigies, rarities, curiosities, sports of nature. So freak was not imagined as something abnormal, but rather as a demonstration of divine variation and the power that the divine or superstition may have had to create these amazing and interesting, different, rare forms. Caprice and whimsy are important words that were synonymous with freak in the older version of what the word meant. That is to say, they were imagined as sports, as something that was charming and interesting and engaging and worth paying to look at. So there are a variety of different ways to make freaks of nature. There are rare forms, and I'm going to give you some examples. Here is an early, from 1724, early prodigy or freak of nature, and this is a man named Mathias or Matthew Buchinger. He was a German man who was born more or less armless and legless. So we would have imagined him now, of course, to be someone born with a congenital disability or some sort of deformation that violates the form that we expect people to be born into. But at this time, he was understood as a wonder, and he was an entertainer. He was an armless and a legless calligrapher, a marksman. He did a tremendous number. Here's another poster of him. This is from a collection you might be interested in that the magician Ricky Jay has of Matthew Buchinger's work and his calligraphy. So we were invited to look at Matthew Buchinger and to imagine how an armless calligrapher could operate and how an armless marksman could manage in the world. And he was understood as a wonder, someone who would elicit from us this imaginative experience of the wondrous. Here is an example of some of his calligraphy that he did armlessly. Pere in 1579 gives us, he was an early anatomist, gives us a book, and he's fascinated by a very rare form of human embodiment, rare but regularly occurring, and that is the occurrence of conjoined people. Almost all of us, of course, are born as singletons, but occasionally the rare forms of conjoinment come forward into the world. And they were understood, again, as events that were demonstrating some kind of divine meaning or something worth our contemplation. So here's an illustration of a variety of different kinds of conjoinment that Pere, the anatomist, drew in 1579. So these were understood as wondrous rather than as mistakes. And by the 19th century, we have a very robust entertainment industry that freaks of nature, that is to say the whimsical productions of nature, give us. Here is an example of Chang and Eng Bunker, who were the actual names of the original Siamese twins who were brought to the United States to perform by P.T. Barnum. And they were celebrities of their times. They were rich men because they were paid well to be in Barnum's shows and museums. And here's a photograph of them from 1865. Here is a poster advertising them when they did a tour of, this is I think from the UK, gives you an idea of the kind of ways that they were talked about, the kinds of places that they performed, and that they were witnessed as being these freaks of nature, these wonders, these sources of entertainment. At the same time, of course, they were being studied by medicine and science, which was developing a different way of looking at human variation the medicalization of human variation that we can talk about more if we'd like. Here's an example of some other conjoined, very dramatically conjoined boys, the Tochi brothers, who have a particular form of conjoinment that is unsettling to us singletons, and they performed for a few years as the two-headed boy, the greatest living wonder in the whole world. So form, like Matthew Buchinger's form and the conjoined twins, or the conjoined people, that was one violation of our regular expectations. Another violation of our expectations is a violation of scale. So here is an example of Charles Stratton, more well known as General Tom Thumb, who worked for P.T. Barnum. He was one of the richest men of the 19th century and one of the most photographed men of the 19th century. His scale violation, if you will, is demonstrated here through the choreography in the photography. You see here that he's standing next to a chair and a top hat, which give the visual explanation of his scale violation, that he's a very small person. Here's a poster from the Victoria and Albert Museum in London showing his performance before Queen Victoria, which was a very important event. His wedding to Lavinia Warren was understood as one of the most photographed and important events of the 19th century. He was married in Grace Cathedral in New York. Here's a photograph to give you an idea of how these scale violations and the wonder and interest that was to come from them was created. So this is a giantess who becomes a giantess only by being placed next to a regular sized or a typically sized person. In contrast here, we have a 1970 photograph from the photographer Diane Arbus. This is a very famous photograph of Eddie Carmel, who she called the Jewish giant at home with his parents in the Bronx, New York, 1970. And you see that his giantism here is created in part by his juxtaposition to his rather perplexed-looking parents. So I want to end with some pictures of hybrids. So hybrids are another way of creating a wonder or a freak of nature. A hybrid, of course, is a combination of two things that ought not to be together. And most hybrids are understood as combinations of animals and people together. So I have a few examples of these. Here is from 1580, a hirsute man, that is to say, a man who has more hair than might be expected on his face. This is a picture of him with his wife. From the 19th century, we have a very famous figure, Lionel, the lion-faced boy, again, a hirsute man. And hirsuteness is a particular genetic condition that occurs, of course, in families. So there are families of hirsute people. This is a poster for Lionel from, obviously, Italy, showing him reading Shakespeare, which is actually quite interesting. And finally, I want to show you a picture of Julia Pastrana, who was a woman from Mexico who was displayed in the United States and abroad. And she was understood as a hybrid of a bear and a woman, and this was emphasized a great deal by dressing her in very typical feminine dress, and of course accentuating her hirsute face and the features that were understood as being more like an ape or a bear. So her hybridity was increased in the performances, and this is a poster of her, which I think is quite lovely. She was understood as a nondescript, and she was holding her levees in Regent Street at a gallery. So I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Check. Check, check. Okay, good. Hi, everyone. All right. Where's my clock? Clicker. What nature is at any given era, why it is, and what it is are variables that are completely dependent on historically shifting relations between humankind and our environment. Nature will still be nature with or without people, as deserts and melting glaciers exemplify. In 1890, Oscar Wilde said that if we regard nature as a collection of phenomena external to man, people only discover in her what they bring to her. She has no suggestions of her own. Life imitates art, and that art designs nature, suggesting that cultures portray their own nature just as painters portray their own natures. In 1950, Claude Lévi-Strauss argued that the design and construction of nature is a main project of culture, and that every culture employs its arts and sciences to establish and maintain a view of the natural world that distinguishes nature from culture, even as it invents that nature with its own absolute cultural values. So if life imitates art and art designs nature, the works of art and science must necessarily reconfirm or redesign its own designs of nature. And this nature will be visible in art long before we recognize it in the natural world. These images confirm the design of nature as we have imagined it since the Enlightenment. They represent the look of nature as an emblem of abiding beauty and sublimity, balanced, cyclical, and eternal. Not that one, this one. If we step back and look at the global history of representation, very few cultures made the cultural constructs of their natural world, but making pictures of it. Some indigenous cultures tend to construct the natural world out of totems, pictographs, free from frames and perspectival arrangements, as we see here in the pre-Hispanic Aztec document. The practice of representing nature, the natural world, is rigorously bound in time and space. Upon entering Mexico or East Los Angeles, the language of the land is replaced by the language of the body. Quetzalcoatl reigns, the eagle and the serpent struggle, and volcanoes are warriors and priestesses, as we see right here. El Popo, Popocatépetl, and Iztaccíhuatl. I don't know if I said this already, not all peoples look for the same things in the natural world. Dave Hickey, in his essay, Shooting the Land, for the exhibition The Altered Landscapes, Photographs of a Changing Environment at the Nevada Museum of Art, says that we take the landscape wherever we go, in our eyes or as portable images. The iconic images of the landscape remains ideologically specific to the traditions of Northern European Protestantism, which emphasizes the perspectival view of a nature in which the visible word, as written in the New Book of Nature, and the flesh of simple, civilized urban humans are profoundly distinguished. So much so that the images of worldly, fleshy creatures like ourselves rarely sully the wild and vegetarian nature of these landscapes and images. The photographs of the Altered Landscape collection may be said to participate in the Puritan modernist branch of the tradition, mimicking the reductive formalist territories of European modernism, banishing men and women from the lost Eden of the landscape and further complicating its problematic relationship with the material world itself. Ansel Adams erased the mountain letters LP for Lone Pine, suppressing the local specificity and the factual historicity of the image in pursuit of the pure, eternal visual idea of nature. So you can see right there that he erased those from there to there. According to Hickey, we are spiritual tourists in the material world. As creatures of the eye, we read the world but rarely deign to caress it. And as a consequence, the glass wall that the camera deploys between the body and the world, through which only the eye may pass, lends itself perfectly to the disembodiment romance with the evacuated landscape that presents itself to us as a container for the spirit. I think we're dead. I think I need your help, Mark. Thank you. I'll continue talking. Contemporary artists working with a new relation to and representation of nature face two main problems. First, we must somehow secularize the subject matter with complex religious overtones. Great. Second, we must somehow redeem a practice whose formal and aesthetic virtues are heavily invested with those transhistorical religious overtones. So there is a kind of ecology at work here, an awareness of the shortcomings of photography's traditional virtues and the willingness to exploit them. So this is an image by Pere Hui, a French artist who works in a variety of media, from films and sculptures to public interventions and living systems, complicating the representation of nature by actually creating a live marine ecosystem. So again, Hickey insists that we must break the metaphorical assumption that binds the photographic instant to the natural eternity, the formal picture to the balanced nature, the high contrast light glamorous of angle light to the stability of nature's cycles. In contemporary landscape photography, we shoot second and we ask questions first. We work to constantly fail to evoke a traditional landscape imagery. We maintain the traditional look of a fine art nature picture while conveying a sense of irony, of loss. We create exquisite, well-composed pictures of a landscape that is anything but balanced and eternal. In this photograph, my subject is vulnerable in the middle of the Arctic where nothing wants her to live. We create a landscape ravaged by natural catastrophe, human depredation, exploitation, and other ephemeral intrusions. Like here I have atop the glorious glacier in Iceland, we don't see a pristine landscape, but a series of unmanned weather stations. These intrusions may be test sites, brush fires, septic tanks, track homes, or a mining site like in my series Arctic Coal, Barentsburg 1 in Svalbard. And here you may see, but it is ironic that you have the landscape and they paint, there is a beautiful mural of a forest just as you're entering the coal mine. So even trying to warm up or trying to make sense out of this collision of the man-made and the natural. We may intrude upon the Anglo-Protestant language of pictured with, let's say, facts. Or with unexpected national iconography, questioning gender in exploration and colonialism. And this is my work called El Norte, captured in Svalbard. With this work, Circumsolar Migration 3, a contemplation of migratory seabirds, I formalize the seascape image so that the boundary dividing sea and sky becomes unstable and blurred. The spatial shift, together with a low video frame rate, furthers this abstraction so we may understand the migratory impetus as code, a genetic code for evolutionary preservation. With this work, I reflect on how we as human species no longer have an understanding of our place within the great scheme of life. Cultural theorist Sanford Quinter's ideas on nature have inspired an ongoing series of work called At Any Given Moment, shown here. He says, "Nothing is ever arrested, and form is never more than an illusion. No one who ever took nature as an image for the design of form ever got it right. Nature represents a certain way that events are produced, a certain rhythm of emission, of contraction and dilation. It is a design engine responsible less for the matter it organizes than for the organizational forces it deploys." And this is At Any Given Moment, River 3. With this work, I seek to enter in relation to the natural world through the nature of matter, from light, sound, and rocks. And I create immersive installations for a fully embodied experience. Circumsolar is a growing body of artworks that emerges from my profound love for the Arctic tern, a small seabird that makes the longest migration of any creature in the world, flying from the Arctic to the Antarctic and back again, from boreal summer to austral summer, over 300 miles a day, a year total of 60,000 miles. Circumsolar Migration 1 is a 26-minute video that focuses on the Arctic tern's breeding season, which I captured in 16mm film with some HD video in Iceland, Svalbard, and Finland. Young terns eat a variety of fish whose own migratory paths are changing due to the warming ocean. Recent research reveals that 90% of the chicks are dying due to starvation, and this is true to most seabirds. With this long-term project, I actively seek to enter the awareness of the Arctic tern, to become with another species, to nurture an interspecies friendship with a wild animal. And here I am inspired by Donna Haraway's ideas about making kin as a way to interact in a multiple species world. I think we can bring the volume up, Mark, please. Thank you. We live in disturbing times, mixed-up times, troubling and turbid times, as Donna Haraway warns us in her book, Staying with the Trouble, Making Kin in the Thulocene. And she says that the task is to become capable with each other and in all of our bumptious kinds of response. Inspired by this, I created Ascent of Weavers, a collaboration with the Hernandez-Quero family of weavers, of Zapotec descent. One of them, Gildardo, is sitting in the back and is a curandero. It's right, sitting down back there, a healer. I came across a fascinating research paper that inspired me, Women Weavers, Warrior Goddesses, Textile Traditions in the Zapotec region of southern Oaxaca. Tlazolteotl is one of these goddesses associated with cotton and weaving. And this is the trailer of the work.
Kids. Shnya. Nagas. Kiba. Midokubit. Pasa na relatsna bidobai. Den hyujar fikaklo yu naba so kachelo. Tekishesi kilien ste nesosta kiga. Sikak sakuchana fisakasa. Kolkipa kolkuatia nare kanina be tegusiani la tegusiani la nare kani se kuatia be chanebe se
The view of nature I am compelled to create is one that is, as Haraway describes, full of inheritances, of remembering, full of comings, of nurturing what might still be. One where us as mortal critters are entwined in a myriad of unfinished configurations of places, times, matters, and meanings. Gracias.
Thank you, Rebecca. All right. Come on back up here, Rosemarie, Evan, Rebecca. It is our opportunity now to just thread the needle across us and between us. And I'm glad you are. It's chilly in here. So I just like to just start with a question for you all, and then you can carry on from here. I'd like to know, when you wake up at 4 a.m, what are you thinking about? What's on your mind?
Hoping traffic's
Which one?
Hoping traffic's not going to be too bad today. Just kidding. I think about my daughter a lot and what the future would hold for her. She's 3 years old, and in the year, she'd be 84 in the year 2100. Wow. So that puts I think things on a different time scale when you think, what is the world going to be like in 2100? And that's what inspires me to pursue the work that I do, I think.
Yeah, gotcha. How about you, Rosemarie? What are you waking up and worrying about?
Well, I don't know about worrying, but
okay, dreaming about.
Since I've been working in bioethics, which is a relatively new set of conversations, if you will, about really who we will have and not have in the world. So I've been invited into a lot of conversations about genetic editing, which is a very current concern, particularly since some scientists have used genetic editing to create people that are genetically altered. And this is a very controversial kind of thing to do. And so I think a lot about what it will be like when human variation is smoothed out, and what it will be like for all of us when we end up being almost all the same. Mm-hmm. And what we'll lose.
Oh. That's big. Yeah. Do you want to tell us what your cat, but what else?
Oh my God, yes.
For me, I think that...
What are you thinking about your cat, by the way? You're alive.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just the kind of... it's not what I want to talk about. But I feel... but, yeah, really is... I already have all the hairs all over these clothes. But I think that I question a lot what art is and the role it has in our times. And what being human is. Because I think everything is up for grabs. Everything is, we are having such urgent issues to deal with, that the way that we have behaved, all the different habits that we have, the consumption habits we have, everything, nothing is viable anymore. So for me, I think that I keep thinking is like, where is this? How does this human gets reshuffled to value differently, to be able to with the capacities I have as a creative person, to use them for exactly that your daughter has a future. And that is just, for me, is like when for example, I see Greta, I'm like, I'm behind you. And I'm really trying to figure out, what can I do? And I need to do it now so your daughter has a future. That's...
Yeah, that was...
I mean, the work was so beautiful, and thank you for sharing it.
Thank you.
I think that what I do in the botanical garden world is presenting storytelling to the public in that same vein, and I think there's a lot we could learn in our field about how to bring beauty into the conversation in a way that you're doing with your art. Often we come from a more like kind of pragmatic, sciencey sort of perspective where how many species do we have and which ones are growing well and what ecological zone do they come from. But I feel like the artists can really capture the public imagination. It seems like we all agree that that's what we all can agree that nature is in need of a lot of energy and effort and a lot of cultural kind of increasing its cultural relevance. And so I think that bringing artists and scientists and people who share science with the public, like myself and the botanical world, could be very powerful to doing that. We better start working on it quick because there's a lot of work to do.
I want to ask,
I do want to say one thing, though, that I think is really important. And I want to point to a paradox, because all three of us really are pointing out the human community's capacity to hurt the world that we live in together, to hurt each other, to call into question the future that we're all building here together. And that's a really important thing to do. But on the other hand, it's also important for us to recognize that right now, at this moment, in this room, it is in some ways the best time for, like, women. Right now, at this moment, in this room, is the best time for, say, women or people with disabilities, I work in this area, in all of human history to have been alive. And that we can hold that paradox of these opportunities that are present for us just right here now, and the perils that we've called attention to about how we as a human community are living together. To hold those things in tension, I think, is really important. Especially, I think, working with, with young people. That's part of what we're able to present you with too, are these opportunities. Like, this is the best time to have a disability in all of human history.
especially right here, right now.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's not everywhere.
No, I'm talking about right here, right now. And that's not, trying to romanticize American progress or anything like that. But I think it is important when we think about the way we are destroying nature and the perils that we have to also recognize that we are in a moment of great opportunity.
I like the combination of peril and possibility and opportunity. There's a lot of P's in there.
Yeah.
But it also makes me think about the justice work that we have done and the justice work we have to do. I wanted to ask you, I can't help but notice that, and we talked about this earlier when we talked earlier on the phone, just so you know. But each of you are talking about collections. Like Evan, I guess I'm moved by this idea of saving all of the biodiversity that can be saved and holding it in freezers if we cannot allow it to flourish on its own until such time, or so that history won't, it won't be forgotten. And that's one of your jobs is to cultivate almost like a living museum of our biodiversity. And then on the other hand, Rosemarie, you were talking about freak shows, as it were. I mean, you didn't actually speak much about the shows themselves, but these collections of human beings.
Understood as curiosities and wonders.
Yeah, I like how you put a positive spin on, the notion of wonder, the possibilities of all the genetic potential of who we can be. And then, Rebeca, you also, you not only shared with us a collection of work on landscape and nature, but your own work is constantly being viewed as a collection, side by side by side by side. So I'm not really... I'd love to just talk about the penchant that we have to collect, the need, and in some ways the science, like how science and science justice or science injustice are working for you when you think about your collections.
Well, actually, part of the stuff that you were talking about triggered some thoughts for me that most of the plants that you'd encounter on the landscape are freaks of nature. They're mutants that have been either intentionally bred to be that way, or they were, a mutant, like double-flowered form of a camellia that we then cloned. So the kind of oddity or freak show in the botanical world. A rarity. Yeah, exactly. They're the kind of the one that's different from everyone else is the one that's coveted, and that's in the horticulture world. The very human world of maintaining plants. In the kind of modern biodiversity conservation world, it's really the same thing. It's the rare population, the rare species
that's coveted.
That
has value.
That's hard to find. That is most likely to go extinct. So that's the kind of maintenance of diversity that we're going for. And then the other thing that made me think of is just the botanical freak shows of the Victorian era, which were pretty great. And it was around the same time. And it was like the, curiosities of the vegetable kingdom. They would,
oh, absolutely.
Yeah, they would take like the giant sequoia, slabs of giant sequoia, which is just the most massive tree in the world, and ship them to Chicago or New York. And it was like a freak show, like a plant freak show. Yeah. And people, they would pay good money to go see these vegetable curiosities, and that. Still is sort of what we're doing, where if you come to our garden, you can see all these aloes, and it looks like a Dr. Seuss landscape. So we're creating an immersive landscape that's just very unusual and interesting. But then we're trying to add this layer of, oh crap, every plant on the earth might go extinct. We better do something. So it's this sort of this dual. Bringing the wonder, which is such an important part of capturing the public imagination, and then just like the raw numbers and of the amount of species that are kind of threatened right now. And we've had a lot of discussions with people in my circles about this, and we're kind of keenly aware that the little, the really rare, as an example, the really rare spine flower. A spine flower, it doesn't, the name doesn't really sound that great, but it's like maybe like a silver dollar size little sprig of crumbly stems that has a very nondescript flower, and you could easily step on it and not know that it's like one of the most endangered plants in the world. But those are things that will slip through the crack because they don't necessarily inspire that human wonder. Whereas the giant sequoia, I don't think there's any worry of that going extinct because it's just so powerful and emotionally charged for people.
Well, and the scale.
Right, the scale of it too, yeah.
Right.
Now I'm worried about the little spinule.
I did a big project with the spine flower where we collected the seeds and they were when you saw them, and it comes from this one small area in San Diego. This is the orcut spine flower, Coryzanthe orcutiana. And in nature, it's literally just like a little brown nub like that. But when you bring it into the human environment and you give it fertilizer and you give it a lot of water, you can grow it into a plant that's like this big, and take one seed and make a couple thousand seeds, and then bring that back to nature and try to rebuild the populations and re-diversify the landscape. But it doesn't always work, but it does work. Something there's definitely success stories in doing this type of work. So
the sort of inverse between these unusual, wondrous things that have extraordinary value because there's so few, and these unusual, wondrous human beings who suffer because they're considered to be atypical in some way, irregular, as you pointed out. It's such a tremendous contrast. And, of course, I'm thinking about eugenics and the potential right now, as you talk about the potential that we have in science, in the new genetics, to create a more perfect,
or at least a more standard.
Yeah, that's a much better word. A more standard human population. And that this is a new form. It's right in our laps of the work of creating a more masterful race, the eugenic work of science, the pseudoscience of eugenics. I don't know if you want to say something about that, but that's terrifying.
Well, I think the reason that it's threatening, similarly to your work, is that whatever we is, there are people who have the capacity to make decisions about who it is that's going to be in the world and what it is that we value, or what kinds of traits will be elevated and brought forward and cultivated, and what kinds of traits will be lost or excluded. And we know in the history of eugenics that those decisions are basically made by those who have the power to make the decisions, and the people that we will end up with will be more of the same kind of people.
Rosemarie, it just occurred to me, would you just tell us a little bit about what eugenics is? Because I think most of us know, but it's kind of nice to have a little refresher on that one.
Well, eugenics is a way of thinking that develops at the end of the 19th century with the rise of science. People such as Darwin and Darwin's cousin Galton, who start to think about eugenics means good genes, about what kind of traits and what kind of people are the best people, and what kind of people are the worst kind of people, and how we can create more of what some people think are the best people, and eliminate the people that are thought to be the worst kind of people, the most undesirable kind of people. And so you can imagine how this gets carried out. And what happens is in the United States and a lot of all over, but certainly in the Western nations, there's massive sterilization programs in which people understood as feeble-minded or genetically inferior for one reason or another, deaf people, people with a variety of other kinds of disabilities, get targeted for elimination. And then, of course, the Nazis come along, coming to power in the 1930s at the height of eugenic thinking, and they carry out this concept of positive eugenics, which is getting the right kind of people to breed more. So they wanted more Aryans, and getting rid of what any culture or nation decides is the wrong kind of people. So what the Nazis were able to do, because it was a totalitarian regime, was to try to get rid of the people they thought of as inferior, and those were the Jews, the gypsies, people with disabilities. And they were actually able to go down the road of doing that fairly effectively. And that called attention to the problem with eugenic thinking. So eugenic thinking was to be very progressive. It was going to improve humankind.
Progress, yeah.
It was progress. So we learned something from that, and yet we are starting down that road again by thinking that we're going to improve the human stock by eliminating some kinds of people and making it possible for other kinds of people to thrive. And I think what we ought to do is have a kind of attitude of humility and stewardship, which is, of course, exactly what the kind of work that you do advocates. Not only over biodiversity, but over human biodiversity.
And I would say also that, Rebecca, I think your work also speaks to us about a kind of humility, a kind of recognition of, first of all, the things that are right there in front of us, that we, from which we can regain a sense of our own place in the meaning of things by watching the tumbling of grass, or by seeing the whiteness of the cold, or whatever. I think that, would you like to talk a little bit about the part in you that is bringing these images forward? Because I think it's about humility in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me it is so nature and everything in the world, from the smallest thing, it is worthy of my attention, because especially I do not know it. So one of the things that has brought us to where we are as a humankind and with our world is the belief, and you read it perfectly well, in terms of having domain over everything, and without even bothering to understand it, to know it, to listen to it. Right now in our class, in our senior class, our students are entering into an interspecies friendship with a wild animal, and it is through birds. So the very first, class, we end up going to Bajona and looking. Everybody just, for the first time, they were looking, through binoculars and shooting with a 400 lens, and this bird just landed on the head of one of the students. And but that had never happened to me. I mean, I've gone so everywhere, around birds all my life. And so there was such a beautiful moment of awe, because nature touched us for a moment. And I think that, for us, we think we understand nature because either we can photograph it, or we can view it on TV, or we can go for a walk. But one of the things about being in the land, and for example with my Arctic tern, that in order for me to film her with a 16 millimeter, once I shut the iris so that it is dark, just small enough so I can have the right depth of field and all of that, I don't see through it. So that means I have to learn with my body. First, I have to know its behavior of, okay, it goes from there, and it goes there, and it goes there, and it goes down, and it goes there, and it goes there. So it takes me like 5-6 hours to learn its behavior so that then I can film. And meanwhile, I'm living amongst these beautiful creatures. So what that does is that it really makes me humble because I do not understand them. I do not know nature as, I can't control it.
And we're going to move to this in a second, but I just can't help but notice that not only is there the thing that you make that offers us an opportunity to reflect and be in relationship to and quiet down, but the process that you are involved in making is in itself a kind of practice of humility and quiet. 5 hours to watch your bird.
To learn one move and then stay another 2 days to actually film it. Right. And so it is really about, just being in nature. That's what it was, the journey as the medium in itself. I feel that the artifacts I can bring back are so minimal comparing to the experience of being in the world, of being in nature. And I know that for me, more and more, there's two things, and that I wanted to talk a little about the collection of art in an interesting way.
We'll do a short one, and then we'll go over to the audience.
Yeah, and it is about the way in which right now there's two collections that I'm in, and one is the Art and Environment Center in Nevada, that it is Bill Fox who collects. It says art that walks the earth. So it is all about Arctic and Antarctic, and primarily Arctic exploration. So it's art and that walks in the earth. And the other one is the Alaska Anchorage Museum of Art, in which what those two do is they help me enter into community. So suddenly they're invested in me, I'm invested in them, I'm invested in their community, in their interest, in their land, in their, how they're going to be affected. So it's how also as artists we connect.
Right. Okay, so let's pause there. This is that moment where if you're not sitting next to someone, you're going to have to move over. And we'd like you to talk to one another about, well, what's the part of nature that we haven't talked about or need to talk about, or what's come up here that is now starting to become an idea or a question of your own. So please, let's have a moment to talk. We're going to come right back. It's going to be very short, so just try your idea out on someone else. We want to hear from you, and the only thing I want to say, I say it each week, is keep it short, because then more people, we can do more of this. So we have microphones, and right here in the middle, I think your name is Hua. Got it. Yeah. So Hua would like a microphone, and maybe if somebody, okay, great, right after. Thank you. And then after that.
Hi. So my question is, well, I'm mostly directing it to Evan, but anyone else could answer. With the understanding that natures change, and there's always evolution, and even now, humans were being born with some body parts missing. What role does biodiversity preservation play in that sort of state? Because are we trying to achieve something that's constant, or are we trying to mediate change? Who decides what stays and what doesn't?
Wow, okay.
Yeah, that's a great question. I sort of alluded to that a little bit, that a lot of traditional ecology has based, in North America, has based, given a baseline for what the way things should be, being the day that Europeans arrived in North America. But that's sort of an arbitrary, that was it's sort of an arbitrary distinction because there was people here making ecological change. So if it's humans affecting a landscape, then we should go back further. And when you start playing that game, it all sort of breaks down, and those baselines fall apart. But I think that most people in my field are inspired by just maintaining as much like uniqueness as possible. So that Mendez iris that I showed you, there's like 3 or 4 populations of that in the world, and it's a really beautiful example. And not necessarily trying to control the ecology, but just say like, let's keep a place for the Mendez iris, so that in 100 years someone can go and see it because it's beautiful, and all the other organisms that are attached to it. I mean, we'll never control ecology, but we can try to lift it up so that we're not just creating like, the street plants and those interstitial natural areas that I was showing. They're interesting and they're kind of fun to learn about, but it would be a sad world if that's all there was and Mendez iris wasn't here anymore, because Mendez iris has, a long and interesting history, and it's such a unique thing to find. And that those plants of those alleyways, you could go to Rome or Cape Town or Perth, and you'd find basically the exact same plants growing. So I think maintaining regional identity within is one of the goals. But you're right. It is a human decision, and those decisions are made in concert with a lot of people. But hopefully feedback from people like yourself. I think it's a great question.
I think that the question could also apply to Rosemarie, and I wonder if you would.
I think it's very interesting that the rationale for biodiversity conservation in the plant and animal world is so intuitive to us, and it makes so much sense to support it. But when we think about biodiversity conservation in the human world, that's very counterintuitive. It's hard to wrap our heads around the argument for why we should have huge variation in human form and capacity. And I think it is one of maybe the most challenging questions that we could ask as to why that is.
Yeah, and it's so incredibly uncomfortable to know that somebody will have the decision to make the decision of what diversity is, right, and who is worthy of staying in the pool of diversity. Right. I mean, I think that this is definitely something that just put that in the hands of the wrong people, and then you have the worst, social strata that will be now in base of genes and not necessarily, in economic or anything. But it is problematic. I mean, just corporations are going to be the ones owning this, and so that is really the difficult.
Well, they already are.
They already are, exactly. So, for example, the way that Standard fruit company just eliminated all the variety of bananas. In Mexico, we have like 30 kinds of bananas that you can work with. In the United States, you can work with. Right? That's the difference. You go to a market in Mexico and fruits are exploding because there is diversity and there is variety. And so that's the difficulty that I just see that it's going to be the end of flavor.
Right over here.
So we've talked about the false dichotomy of human versus nature. So do you guys think that contemporary concerns about the fragility of nature are a testament to humans' concern or empathy for the natural world, or for saving our own species? And if the latter, does this mean our constructed separation from the natural world is conducive to not belonging in it?
I have to say I'm not sure I heard
the
whole
neither.
question.
I didn't hear the whole.
Would you be able to, just one more time?
Is this good?
Yeah.
All right. So are contemporary concerns about the fragility of nature a testament to humanity's concern or empathy for the natural world, or for saving our own species?
Great question.
Nature is not fragile at all. Humans are screwed.
Yeah.
Yeah, nature could care less about us. On the other hand, nature is beginning to just show its force, and yes, species will fall here and there, but really it's for our own survival that we should actually pay attention, because we are really the ones that will just be on the chopping board at the beginning of it. Yeah, no, it's so much of the work that I do is also because I'm concerned about the human species survival. And for that, we need all that diversity, and we need to protect that. Our environment is for us. We still think it's amazing that there's still so much belief that we can control nature. What is wrong with us humans? We can't. We can't. Nature is wild.
So with the advancements in 3D printing and 3D bioprinting and genetic modifications and a lot of genetic advancements, do you think that we will be able to save lost biodiversity via just 3D printing, or in the future we can go to a damaged ecosystem, we can find out what we need, and we can 3D print, let's say, an organism that will adapt to that environment for years to come? Do you think that might be a possibility?
I think that we may be able to bring organisms back from extinction using DNA, and people are actually working on that. Like the San Diego Zoo is trying to do that with a species of rhinoceros, I believe. But it's really difficult. We're really bad at rebuilding nature right now. So it's just so complicated, and there's so many interactions, and there's biological interactions, but also interactions with the environment, with weather, with geology, and there's a lot of places in the world that have been totally just scraped of their natural vegetation and wildlife, and then people have tried to rebuild it, and you never really get back what you had before. It's very difficult. So I think we should keep working on it, but I'm not confident that we'll be able to put Humpty Dumpty back together again.
No, and I think that, for me, I'm thinking the way in which we think still with that dominion point of view, right? We still want to be able to, okay, we're going to exterminate polar bears. Okay, let's just save one and let's rebuild it and let's make all of these. So it's this idea that we are at the top of everything, manipulating nature in all possible ways, and all what we're creating is really the isolation, the way that something outside of its history, ecology, some of the birds that have been for millennia out, right, and then trying to recreate something in our ideal conditions. It is it will be a different kind of life, but it will never be what it was. So what is it that we would be recreating if all of these mental concepts, our concepts of what life is, and I really wish that we as humans at this time, we would actually put the brakes on our playing God and instead just become humble and realize that life, the complexity of life, from the plankton, that it is this entire chain, is as valuable as our own species. And then we might preserve the earth. But the way we're going is it's so
I think we need to think like gardeners, not architects, but gardeners.
Yes, exactly, gardeners, beautiful. Yeah. Tending to, yeah.
So you architects out there, urban design,
landscape.
Nothing
wrong with being an architect. Just incorporate more plants in your work.
We had a question somewhere right back here in the middle of the house. Oh, sorry. Let's where the mic is right now. Okay, there we go. Hello.
Hi there. Excellent discussion. I think that there's one aspect of nature that we haven't touched on, or you haven't touched on in the discussion yet, and it's nature as inclination. Saying that it's my nature. What is my nature? And I'm really curious is, what do you believe human nature is? We've talked about the dichotomy between culture and nature, but I think you've well pointed out that we are a product of nature. But what is our nature when you define it as inclination or intention?
Well, may I answer that just very briefly? I'll be very brief. Octavia Butler says that our demise is that we are highly intelligent but highly hierarchical. So we will forever kill each other.
Not tonight.
The hierarchy is the tough
Now
part.
I'm depressed.
The intelligence is brilliant, but we're highly hierarchical. And that's problematic.
We don't seem to have an understanding of our place in nature. When you look at plants and animals, they seem to know exactly where they are in the scheme of things. Humans are struggling.
I think that it's more complicated for us too, because we have a society, and we have you're writing, and we can pass information from generation to generation, and we can have public conversations in a lecture hall. So I have no idea what human nature is the short answer, but it's so much beyond just like I want to get enough resources so I can have children, which I think is, I want to spread my seeds, or I want to have a litter of puppies, whatever the animals are going for. We with all of our intellectual world and intellectual life have gone so far beyond that it seems like it would be really hard to answer that question.
Yeah, it's so hard. But I think we can decide how to define what human nature is. I mean, we can say that we arc toward vitality. We want to be alive, and we want to connect with each other. We want to make community. I think that's one of the charges that you have, is to go out and define what human nature is and what we as human beings are working toward. There's a lot of room for doing that.
I feel like this evening you're constantly reminding us that we don't need to, play the glass is half empty. We can look at half full, and the opportunity there that we have, and a new generation has to decide where we're going. Just as we can't answer any of these questions, what we can do is act on what we believe them to be. And I think you reminded us about the possibilities right here in this room. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and it's almost like we have no choice but to really imagine this new human that is able to counteract the momentum that we're going into, and to really kind of like steer it towards away from, again, the Enlightenment idea of individualism and rationality, and instead that we are into community and emotion, like really sensing beings. And I do believe that is where we can steer the humankind. And we we have no choice but to imagine that. And to
connect honorably with each other.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? I think these are actually, we're sort of moving in towards how are we going to leave this nature discussion. And I want to just, vitality, how are we going to move together, the possibilities that are amongst us here. I just want to ask each of you for, what thought would you like to plant with us as we, no puns intended, as we move on to the next part of our evening. And I'll start with you.
Sure. Well, as the photos of those back alleys in LA hopefully showed you guys, nature is incredibly resilient, and it finds a way no matter where. And we haven't even talked about timescales, but 1 billion years ago, it was just single-celled life on the Earth. And where are we going to be 1 billion years from now? I'm sure nature will still be here on Earth, and I'm sure it will be beautiful and interesting.
There's a quote that one of my colleagues wrote in, I've been working with the New York Times series on disability written by people with disabilities. And she was writing about her dog who has 3 legs. And I'm always brought back to her conclusion, and that was that all creatures who persist are whole. And I think that that might be a way for us to think about what we've been bringing forward tonight, the idea of wholeness as the capacity and the will to persist and to be.
And very short, but last words, Rebecca.
Greta is the spark. We are the wildfire.
Who is the spark?
Greta Thunberg, right? We are the wildfire.
Thank you all. Thank you to our amazing guests. Let's really put our hands together. Thank you, everyone.